Ladies and gentlemen, this is TVP World. You're watching another edition of Break the Fake, where we debunk fake news and combat false narratives. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee, and let's get rolling. Now, folks, today we're starting off with a story straight from Bizarro World. Close your eyes, snuggle with your loved ones, and once you relax, we're going to start with the crazy. Here we go. According to the latest stories pumped out by the Kremlin propaganda machine, the money used to finance the recent terrorist attack in Russia and potentially more attacks coming in the future came from the Ukrainian energy company Burisma Holdings. Russian officials even opened an investigation into terrorism financing committed by US and NATO. Now, does the name Burisma sound familiar? It should, because back in 2014, the company made headlines after Hunter Biden, the son of then Vice President Joe Biden, joined its board. Now it makes sense, at least to the Russians. Through his son, President Biden is financing international terrorism, especially attacks of the Islamic State targeting Russia.
Итогом проверки, организованной в связи с обращением группы депутатов Госдумы и иных лиц, Следственным комитетом России возбуждено уголовное дело о финансировании терроризма. Установлено, что денежные средства, поступавшие через коммерческие организации, в частности нефтегазовую компанию «Бурисма Холдингс», действующую на территории Украины, на протяжении последних лет использовались для осуществления террористических актов в Российской Федерации, а также за ее пределами, в целях устранения видных политических и общественных деятелей и нанесения экономического ущерба. Следствием во взаимодействии с иными спецслужбами и финансовой разведкой проверяются источники поступления и дальнейшее движение денежных средств в размере нескольких миллионов долларов США, причастность конкретных лиц из числа сотрудников органов власти, общественных коммерческих организаций стран Запада. Кроме того, следственным и оперативным путем отрабатываются связи непосредственных исполнителей террористических актов с иностранными кураторами, организаторами и спонсорами.
But since there's no actual physical Islamic State, the Russians naturally would have a hard time grasping who the enemy actually is. So, to preempt the confusion and make it easier on the Russian public, the Kremlin immediately reoriented the investigation to pin the blame on Ukraine, closer, more tangible enemy of Moscow. The whole story feels as real as the tale of the Iron Wolf, but hey, works with the Russians. And now the righteous anger of a wounded people has to be channeled properly. That means turned against Ukraine and the Americans, who apparently live in Ukraine now in large numbers. Nonsense belief that the US is keeping Ukraine on a leash is of course widespread in Russia, so that wouldn't be a big leap. And now the empire's propaganda apparatus has begun calling for the destruction of Kharkiv, which would, according to Moscow, help break the spirit of the Ukrainian people.
Почему я сторонник того, чтобы оказывать давление, выражусь политкорректно, на Харьков? Город имеет для украинцев большое значение. Ну, я не буду сравнивать там, допустим, Харьков и Одессу, но очень большое значение.
Вы не имеете в виду сейчас военное значение?
Да,
да?
И я имею в виду моральное значение. Взятие или разрушение Харькова окажет, безусловно, тягостное влияние на украинское общество.
Деморализующее.
Деморализующее. А я считаю, что волю этого народа надо ломать об колено. Другого выхода нет. Ну, если уж взялись.
So, time to witness a clash between sound logic and the muddled chaos that we like to call the Russian mind. Let's start with the former. For the past 10 years, the Russians have been telling everyone that they're in Ukraine protecting Russian-speaking Ukrainians whom they consider to be fellow countrymen. But what's actually happening on the ground? Well, the Russians are not exactly targeting the western part of Ukraine, aside from the capital. Most of their wrath and their bombing campaign, leaving entire cities and towns leveled and depopulated, is aimed at the east of Ukraine. So when they're bombing Kharkiv, they're actually killing the people they tell everyone that they're protecting. Many cities in the Donbass have been wiped off the face of the earth by a Russian ordnance. So they're bombing their fellow countrymen they supposedly love and would go to war to protect. Isn't that a little nonsensical? Well, of course, but the everyday reality of the Russian mind does work like this. So protect us, O Lord, from Russian love, and we'll handle their enmity on our own. The year has barely begun, and the showing for the most confused man of the year is already surprisingly strong. And with more competition than the Ascot race, pulling ahead of the rest of the pack is a candidate we previously considered an outsider, rarely featured on Break the Fake, Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
In Ukraine are all Russian.
Right. They speak Russian. Yeah.
Right. And they're ethnic Russian, and Ukraine welcomed the Russians in. So we said, oh, look, he took over Ukraine, but he took it over, and they wanted to be taken over. And Donbass and Lugansk vote to join Russia, these two eastern provinces. And because as soon as that new government came in, which was, there were a lot of them were these ultra-right people who were glorifying the Nazis. Stefan Bandera, who was a Nazi, they put a statue of him up, and they're very.
There's a Nazi problem in Ukraine, right?
There's a huge Nazi problem.
President, how would you think you could fix this situation in Ukraine?
Yeah, I would negotiate a peace. I mean, Putin has repeatedly tried to negotiate a peace, and in fact, he negotiated 2 peace agreements with Zelensky. Zelensky is a U.S. puppet, that we put in there, and he's our puppet there, and he knows if he crosses the U.S., his own ultra-right people will kill him, and the U.S. will stop protecting him. So he does what we say.
Okay, so everyone in Ukraine is ethnically Russian. Donetsk and Luhansk wanted to join Russia as a federal republic. Ukraine is full of Nazis, and its president is a Washington puppet. So not only is he a Jew, he's also a Nazi and a spy for America, aside from being a Russian speaker from Kyrie. In Russian propaganda, President Zelensky is a blend of God, Alpha and Omega, light and darkness, werewolf and vampire. In the wake of the terrorist attack at the Crocus City Hall in Moscow at the end of March, stringent security measures have been put in place across Russia to prevent similar incidents. But does such a sweeping move actually make sense? And how exactly are the Russians planning to catch these terrorists lurking in the shadows? Well, they seem to be picking their targets according to different criteria. Say security operatives have recently detained a patron of the Cyber Pride computer club. 3 special forces operators in technical vests alongside plainclothes officers approached a man as he was sitting at a computer and, playing Counter-Strike. Now, it is currently unknown what the detainee is suspected of, but given recent events, we can imagine the rest of the investigation will go something like this. After a violent interrogation, during which he will lose a finger or an ear, the Russian government will say that he confessed to being a terrorist with ties to Ukraine. All that for a round of dust too. Next time, they'll probably arrest a girl playing The Sims and accuse her of mind-controlling people into terrorism. Meanwhile, the American company Burger King continues to operate in Russia, despite the brand's owner promising to exit the country over 2 years ago. In March 2022, Restaurant Brands International, RBI, the holding company that owns the fast food giant, announced that it had begun the process of withdrawing from Russia. But not long afterward, critics have accused RBI of supporting the Putin regime by failing to divest its stake in Russian businesses. The RBI tried to cover its back, citing a complex franchise agreement with 3 other partners covering around 800 restaurants as the reason for difficulties in exiting the country. You might think Russians would be happy and grateful for the brand, as its war-supporting restaurants stayed in their homeland. Well, think again. Let's take a look at Russians showing their appreciation for the fast food franchise. Oh, it's just par for the course in Russia now, isn't it? We know full well that their love language is destroying everything in sight. They simply don't know anything else. Well, now they have 1 fast food restaurant fewer available. Time to start eating more healthy, I guess. And with that, we conclude this edition of Break the Fake. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.